It's a balancing act. You can't just focus on the customer and everything else take care of itself. You've got to balance all three components. And that's where I think some companies get into trouble. They do get very hyper-focused on the customer. Great. But it's got to be with available resources because there's got to be something left over for employees and shareholders at the end of the day.
Well, welcome back to Good Business. Guys, I am so excited and honored to have Joel Trammell here on the show today. Joel, thank you so much. I know it was just a hike across the city. You're a fellow Texan, but thank you so much for making the time to be with us today.
Delighted to be with you, Clay.
Awesome. Well, guys, the reason why I asked Joel to join is actually I heard about him because we rented his campus for our team retreat. He's got a campus where he does a lot of coaching and teaching, and he is great at marketing himself because I saw all of his books and everything that he had done, and I was like, how have I not heard about this guy? And so we got to talking, and I was like, you've got to be here on Good Business, and I want you to share what you've learned over your many years and honestly, the immense wealth of experience. And so, Joel, I'm just so excited for you to share your story with us today and inspire everybody who's tuning in. So, with that in mind, could you share a little bit about who you are and your background?
Sure. So I guess people describe me as a longtime entrepreneur. Started my first business over 30 years ago. And I did it really, I'm not the classic entrepreneur who has this great idea that they have to just pursue. It was because I'd been in the U.S. Navy teaching what they call Naval Nuclear Power School, where the Navy had assembled a great group of really smart engineers together. And when I left college with an engineering degree, I thought, being smart was what the whole world was about. And so I was amazed when we put all these smart engineers together, how poorly the organization seemed to run. And so I really became fascinated with the concept of how do you run a large organization. And so I decided to start my own business and see if I could figure it out because no one would hire me at 25 to be CEO of their own business. So I had to start my own.
Wow. So tell me a little bit about what that journey was like.
Yeah, so, started a small business, moved to Austin about 32 years ago or something for my wife to get her PhD at the University of Texas. And then sold that business, tried a couple of different things like many people do, some that worked, some that didn't. Finally had the opportunity to do a business with my wife based on some of the intellectual property she had developed in her PhD work. And that business was fortunately very successful, and we built a large business that we sold in 2009 for a couple $100 million. And then I bought the failed assets of another startup and redid that and got lucky and sold that for a 9-figure amount. And so that gave me the opportunity to really focus on what got me into business in the first place, was teaching people and thinking about the problem of how do you run a business at scale.
Wow. So I love that intro because I want to talk about your Chief Executive Operating System. I'd love for you to just give us an overview. What is it? And I'm picking up on some of the reasons why you developed it, but I'd love to know a little background on that as well.
Yeah, so, it was interesting. What really kind of started me down this specific path was I was chairman of what they call the Austin Technology Council, which was the consortium of tech companies in Austin, and we were trying to, improve the market in Austin, and we thought we needed more capital, and we had efforts to bring in some of the venture capitalists and private equity firms into the Austin market. But then if we got the capital, we didn't have CEOs that necessarily knew what to do with the capital. Mm. And so because of my teaching experience and entrepreneurial experience, I said, well, I'll put together a course for CEOs. And that's where it really started about 16 years ago. And so when you teach something, that's really the best way to learn something. And so over time, you refine it, you develop things, people ask you questions, you see the part they don't understand. And so that's really what led to developing the Chief Executive Operating System, was teaching this course for now over 15 years.
Wow. So walk me through it. What is the operating system? I know we
Yeah.
don't have the many hours and days to talk through like how to actually do it, but could you give me an overview of what it is?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of step back and talk about the CEO job itself and what the different levels are, because a lot of people have CEO title, but it can be a very different job depending on the status of the organization. So I divide the CEO job into really kind of three big components. So from 1 to, let's call it 20, 25 employees, somewhere in there, most people are running the business and they are CEO, but they're also really fulfilling all the other executive roles. And they're making all the key decisions about the business. They know what everyone's doing in the business. And so there's no reason for any sophisticated structure. The challenge becomes when you grow outside that number and you start going 25 to 50 or 100. And there you need to functionalize the business and you need to think about running the business in a more systematic way. And now decision-making needs to be pushed down into the organization. And when you reach about 100 to 150 employees, depending on the nature of the business, there's a full-time CEO job. And that's what the Chief Executive Operating System is about, is what is that job at scale? Because it's not doing the job you did at 25 times faster, which is the way a lot of people approach it. It is a unique challenge to manage and run an organization of 150 plus people. And that is a skill that you don't really learn in other jobs. It's one of those skills you kind of have to do it. And so when I, started developing the course and stuff, I thought, Stanford would have a model on how to be CEO and Harvard would have a model, and maybe I would come in as the practical person and tell them, oh, you academics are too theoretical. What I found out was no one had a model. No one had really talked about this, how you run an organization at scale. The only work that had been done in this area was more military history, because, until 50 or 100 years ago, they were the only groups that were running these large organizations at scale. And so, you grab some military theory, you add some of my personal experience, and you develop what I think is really the only operating system I know of for running an organization at scale.
Wow. So how does that ultimately impact profitability for the business? Because that's the goal, right?
Yeah,
You want to be profitable, and what does that look like as you're growing from just an ethics perspective, and making sure that you're caring for your team, caring for your clients, and not impacting negatively the reputation of the business? Because a lot of businesses fail because they grow too quickly.
Sure.
And so I'd just love to hear from you of, all right, how does that approach that you just talked about with the Chief Executive Operating System, how does that affect the outcome of that business?
So, you had, in the intro there, made a fundamental assumption that I'm going to actually take umbrage with, is that the purpose of the business is to generate a profit. I don't think that is the most fundamental purpose of a business. I'm going to tell you the most fundamental purpose of a business is, like any organism, is to survive, okay? To survive and thrive, okay? That the way to do that may involve making a profit. In many cases, it doesn't. Of course, Amazon, for the first 15 years of its existence, didn't make a profit, right? So what are the fundamental characteristics of a business that survives and thrives? Well, in my opinion, you have to do three things. You have to consistently provide value to three groups if you want to make a business survive and thrive. Those three groups are your shareholders, owners, whoever the controlling people of the business. Yes, you have to provide value to those people. That could be in the form of a profit. That could be in the form of high growth. There are a lot of different ways you might provide value depending on the wants and needs of those particular shareholders. You also, at the same time, though, have to consistently provide value to your customers. Because if you're not consistently providing value to your customers, they go away. And then the third piece is you have to consistently provide value to your employees. Because if you don't have good employees that stay with you, you don't have a business. And so that's the real challenge of the CEO job at scale, is balancing those three competing interests. And they're really competing typically for the same resources, right? Because anything I give to customers is a resource that typically could have been provided to employees or shareholders. And anything I do for employees could have gone to shareholders and customers. And obviously, any profits I give to shareholders are resources that could have been used to provide value to customers and employees. So there's this constant balancing act. I call it a triangle of tension between providing value to these three groups. And that ultimately, to me, is the purpose of the organization: survive and thrive.
Wow. All right. This is why I had you on. I knew I was going to learn something fantastic. So, Joel, when it comes to some examples of how you've seen this play out, some just like real world examples.
Oh, sure. We see them all
whether
the
it's
time.
your own companies, some of your clients' companies, or maybe even just real world examples of companies everybody knows.
Right.
How have you seen that successfully played out where they're properly balancing all three of those? And how does it happen?
Yeah, so it requires a lot of effort because what I see more in organizations is neglecting one or more. I remember in the first public company board I was a member of, and I go to the first board meeting, and for the first 4 hours, literally, the only metrics that are being provided, the only data that's being talked about, all relates to shareholders. Things like gross profit, net profit, EBITDA, revenue, all these things that the shareholders were particularly interested in. And so about 4 hours into the board meeting, I remember asking, hey, do we have any data about our customers? And of course, what they said was, our customers love us. They just couldn't imagine doing business with anybody else.
And
I
just
said,
all subjective.
yeah. I said, do you have any data about that? And if so, why is our revenue going down instead of up if our customers really love us? And then later, the HR person's up, and I asked them, do we have any data about our employees? And they're the same way. They're like, our employees just love working here. They couldn't imagine working anywhere else. While I'm sitting there looking at a Glassdoor entry of 2.6. And so a lot of organizations don't understand this balancing act, and so they don't collect information. I mean, I was in a meeting with a small business this week that I'm part of, and they're very attuned to the owner's interests in making a profit, and they're very attuned to the employees because they're a small business, and they still, all the employees fit in a big room.
Yeah.
And I said, who's representing the customer at the table here? I mean, we think the customers are happy with us, but how do we know? Okay, what would the customers want us to do if they were in this room? And so a lot of times it's merely bringing the customer and employee view into the room is the first step that businesses don't do and causes them to fail because they look at it only from the shareholder and financial metrics point of view.
Okay, so many questions, because I'm like, this is amazing. Tell me how. So let's just go through one of these three at a time. So let's talk about your customers. There's a really popular book out there. I don't know if you've read it yet. It's called Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara. Fantastic book. It's all about creating a culture of hospitality regardless of what business you're in. You don't have to be a chef or a restaurant or something like that. You've got to make sure that you're being intentional in caring for your customers and your employees. So he uses examples, Will does, of going above and beyond for their clients and making sure that anyone who gets on the reservation list for 11 11 Madison Avenue, or 11 Madison Park. There it is. I just got it. All right. So EMP, when someone has invested thousands of dollars into a meal and an experience, and when they have been on a wait list, a reservation list for months to get in, they need to have an amazing experience, right? And I mean, he talks about the hot dog and all that kind of stuff. Highly recommend that book. But when you're thinking about specifically making sure you're caring for customers, obviously there's tools to gather that data like NPS scoring and things along those lines. But what have you seen to be a more successful metric for success with your customers that you encourage your clients to track and to engage with? And are there any tactics there?
Yeah, the biggest thing is structurally, does the CEO have someone on their team whose sole responsibility is customer satisfaction with available resources? I mean, that's the job of the customer service exec, is to maximize customer satisfaction with available resources. Most organizations I go into and talk to, that is not a person that is on the CEO's direct reports. They are buried under customer service, maybe under the product group. They're buried under sales and viewed as junior salespeople. And there's nobody sitting at the table whose sole focus is making the customer happy. And that person needs to be at the executive level at the same chair as sales team, marketing team, finance, and your CFO and your other executives. And so structurally, if you don't set that up, you tend to not get good information about the customer, because sales is always going to tell you what sales wants to tell you about getting the deal done. They're not focused on the customer. They're focused on the deal. Their fundamental unit of operation is the deal, right? And you need somebody at the table who thinks about all day, every day, making your customers happy, again, within available resources. And it's really, of course, a comparative business. In some businesses, you need to, have super high levels of customer satisfaction, and in some businesses your competitors are very low and you just need to do a little better than they do, right? And so that's the challenge.
So going back to that boardroom where you asked that question, hey, tell me about the tell me about the customers.
Sure.
They're losing revenue. Obviously, they're not as happy as you think they are.
Right.
How do you fix that?
Yeah.
I mean, and maybe in a more tangible example, how did they respond to you calling that out?
What
was the outcome?
Of course, they didn't respond positively at all to and they didn't do anything different than they had already been doing. But, you start with putting somebody in charge of that function that has clout in the organization. This can't be a, junior person that people can ignore. That is good at building relationships, and you start going talk to the customer. And, people want to do business with you if you're doing a good job of customer satisfaction. We all have those companies that we want to do business with, and that to me is the primary test. And so I want to know not only, are you happy, but what other business can I do with you? Because that's the cheapest sales methodology, is to sell to your existing customers. But most organizations don't have real relationships with their customers where there's a possibility of the customer giving honest feedback, because the customer is not going to tell the person delivering the service that they're doing a bad job, and that person's not going to relay that back into the organization, right? And they're not going to tell a salesperson, the reason I didn't buy from you is because your customers are, or they may not tell a salesperson that's the reason they didn't buy from you or whatever. And so getting to honest feedback is what you're trying to do. And so that requires people who build relationships with the customer, and they understand that when they say something, somebody's going to take that seriously and act on it. Doesn't mean the customer's always right. There's a balance, but the customer's always the customer. And if you don't have an honest view of what the customer really thinks, you're probably not going to be very successful.
Wow, gold mine right there. I mean, we could just be done at this point. But thank you so much for that. What are your thoughts on Unreasonable Hospitality? Are you familiar with that that book or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Four Seasons and who was the other major hotel brand that I'm forgetting, that Ritz-Carlton, I guess, that made they made their brand around providing that level of service. And that, again, makes sense. But I do get concerned when companies say things like the customer is number one. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. What about employees? What about shareholders? It's a balancing act. You can't just focus on the customer and everything else take care of itself. You've got to balance all three components. And that's where I think some companies get into trouble. They do get very hyper-focused on the customer. Great. But it's got to be with available resources, because there's got to be something left over for employees and shareholders at the end of the day.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's pivot. Let's talk about employees.
Sure.
And this is honestly in the same alignment of the customer conversation. So did you ever recommend doing NPS scoring with your customer on the customer front?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that a metric that you find valuable?
Yeah, I mean, the beauty, the challenge with a lot of metrics is you get the numbers 42, but you don't have anything to compare it to.
Yeah.
The beauty of NPS is, if done properly, you do have industry comparisons that can be used, right? And so that's very valuable to see where you are related to other folks. And so I do like that metric. Every business is different what questions you should be asking, but that is a good metric because it's comparable to other companies in your space.
Yeah. So pivoting to employees, do you do or recommend some sort of regular performance evaluation? Obviously, if you're not doing quarterly reviews with your team members, there's a problem. You got to be at least doing that. But when you're thinking about like soliciting feedback, or maybe even anonymously, is that something that you recommend? And if so, how do you typically execute on that?
Absolutely. So I'm a big fan of Gallup's Q12 engagement survey, again, because they have reams of data, and they can show you your scores compared to other companies that are similar in size and even geographic area. And so you can have some idea where you're low, where you're high. It's a simple 12-question anonymous survey. Now, if you're going to do the survey, though, you got to be willing to act on it. I've seen companies that do the survey and then they rationalize to themselves why the scores are low, and they don't really do anything. Well, if you do that, the employees are just going to be discouraged, and you're never going to get good input again. So you have to commit, if you're going to do the Gallup Q12, to taking action on, these are our 3 lowest scores, and here's what we're going to do about those things, and communicating to the employees the changes you're making.
I love it. I love it. Anything else on the employee front that you recommend in regard to investing to make sure it's properly balanced on the triangle?
Well, I just think a lot of CEOs, particularly founder CEOs, they're so fired up for their idea and having success, and the rewards are huge, obviously, if they have success, and they sit around and they wonder why everybody in the company's not as motivated as they are. And I think that's just, kind of crazy to think that somebody you hired that's making $80,000 a year, and 3 years out of college, and owns, none of the company or has none of the rewards, is going to look at that job with the same level of enthusiasm as you do. And so you've got to understand, what are their motivations? Why are they there? They're not there for the same reason you are. Yeah. And so you've got to address those issues if you want those people to be as excited about the organization as you are.
All right. All right. So in your experience, having sold multiple 9-figure companies and had multiple other small businesses that you've been a part of, what has been kind of your favorite success story when it comes to caring for your employees well? Has there been anything that kind of stands out in the 30 years of your history?
Oh, sure. I mean, the great, joy I get at this point in my career is hearing from, former employees, people, and often they will relate a conversation that we had 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. And they'll say, Joel, this made a difference, And unfortunately for me, I don't remember that conversation because for me that day, that was one of 20 conversations I had. But for them, that was the one conversation they had with the CEO that week or month, maybe even, right? Yeah. And I happened to say something that resonated with them and made a difference. And so, I love it because they remind me of these things that I've totally forgotten about. Yeah. And so, when I hear that, something I did, made a difference in their career, that, that's certainly meaningful.
I love it. So when do you think the CEO should stop talking to every single employee on staff? What's that threshold?
Yeah. So it is during that transition from, 20, 25 employees to 100, 150, where you lose touch just inherently with everybody that's part of the organization. And you can't, talk to them in the same way. There has to be a hierarchy, decision making. I mean, the fundamental thing that happens there that people don't think about is that 20 people, one person's making all the key decisions. Yeah. Because it's easier for one person to keep track of all the information than it is to explain to the 20 people how to make a decision. Yeah. The problem is at 150, it is no longer possible for one person to make good decisions because they can't know everything. The amount of information to know at 150 is exponentially greater than at 20. So then the job becomes pushing down the key information that people need to make good decisions into the organization. And that's the fundamental transition. And so the nature of the job changes from you running things to you teaching people really how to run things. Yeah. And what you're trying to do at 150 or 5,000 or 100,000 people is to get the person doing the actual work, the individual contributor, 3, 4, 6 levels below you in the organization, to make the same decision you would make if you were in their position with the information they have available. And that's really what a great CEO does, is gets everybody in the organization making those same decisions based on their understanding of the mission, vision, values of the organization, competitive differentiation, all these key concepts that making the same decision the CEO would make if they were in their shoes.
So I'm going to ask you in 5 minutes or less, how does the CEO actually get that person that they don't really have much contact with making the same kind of decisions with the same level of wisdom that they would.
Yeah, and that's why I wrote a book, right?
So
because
name of the book and where do they find it?
Yeah. That's what the Chief Executive Operating System basically does.
Yeah.
Is from day one. What are all the things you need to do to make that happen and have a good chance? And you're still going to have some employees make bad decisions.
Sure.
But how do you get it pushed down the organization as best you can? And so that is a challenge, and it starts with aligning the organization around a common mission vision. Coming up with what are the differentiating values, because if you have a successful business in the world, that is the anomaly. A successful business is the anomaly. That means you have figured out something about the world that other people didn't figure out. Okay, because 9 out of 10 businesses are going to fail. And even when you get to Fortune 500, if you look at the Fortune 500 list from 30 years ago, about half those companies are no longer on that Fortune 500 list today. Wow. And so if you're being successful in business, you've figured out some unique things. You may not know what they are, though.
Yeah.
And so you've got to dig deep to figure out what are those things that you've really learned. I talk about businesses really are ultimately, just like life, a search for truth. You're constantly trying to find out about reality. I mean, you can have a belief that people want to buy white cars, and you order 10,000 white cars, and you don't sell any, and you find out, no, you were wrong. Okay. That's the beauty of business. Eventually, you got to deal with reality.
Yeah.
And so the more you can search and figure out what's real about your business, what's unique about your business, then you've got to communicate that down to the team. And obviously, it can't be 100 things. It's got to be 3 or 4 or 5 key concepts that you're communicating to people, and then aligning them consistently around that vision and direction you want to go.
Wow. Love it. Love it. All right. So we've talked a lot about employees. We've talked a lot about customers. Let's talk about shareholders.
Yeah.
So in most small businesses, there's likely 1 or 2 shareholders.
Yep.
It's the owner, the founder, and if they had a couple investors maybe. But when they cross over that 25 to whatever it might be, 5,000 employees, how do you recommend interacting with those shareholders to the point where they are cared for, but they're not being given too much attention?
Yeah. So, it's very important that as a CEO, you understand what are the real motivating factors for the shareholders. Because again, a lot of people just assume we want to make money. And that often is not the way you maximize value for the shareholders. What you're trying to do with the shareholders is maximize value, but maximize value over the long term. I always tell people you assume the business is going to be around forever, even though there's a high likelihood, especially if you're venture-backed or PE-backed, that you're not going to stay with it forever because there's going to be some transaction that happens.
Yeah.
You need to run the business like it's going to be around forever. And so for your shareholders, what is their how can you provide greatest value? And a lot of early stage small businesses, the actual way you provide the greatest value is high growth rate, right? I mean, again, back to Amazon, it was all about the growth rate. It was not about, are we making money? Now, there need to be a path to profitability.
Yeah.
Now, in some family-owned type businesses, the purpose of the business is to generate a cash flow.
Yeah.
And so, we're trying to maximize cash flow. Can be slightly different than profit, of course, as well. And, in Wall Street, a lot of times it is earnings per share, on a quarterly basis is the thing that people are looking for. So, but deeply understanding the motivations of your shareholders. And of course, for a lot of small business owners, they've got a spouse who's a half owner of that business too, that may have slightly different, goals and aspirations and risk profiles than they do. And so often that becomes a challenge as well.
So we talked a little bit about this before the camera started rolling, but I think you and I can both say that we're fans of Lencioni.
Absolutely.
And he wrote this book called The Motive.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm bringing it up is I'm reading through it right now. It's fantastic.
Great,
I love it.
Yeah.
I haven't finished it yet, but I'm almost there. But the thing that stood out to me was, at least in the first half of the book during the fable section, it was talking about this preconceived notion that CEOs should be intimately involved in the daily workings of the business to make sure that no one makes the wrong decision, right? Yeah. Especially when, the CEO may have a background in marketing. Maybe he wants to make sure, or she wants to make sure, hey, marketing's got to be right. But really what it boils down to is it's all a matter of expectation management with your shareholders, expectation management with your employees, and expectation management with your customers. That's all it is, right? To strike that balance.
Sure.
It's if you can set the proper expectations with your shareholders that they can't call you up every single day to get an update
Right.
that, hey, no, we'll talk in the board meeting every quarter.
Yeah.
That's when we'll talk. Everything's gonna be fine. And with your employees, setting the expectation of, hey, this is what our interactions should look like. We're not gonna be talking every single day. I'm gonna give you autonomy to own your role, and I'm gonna hold you accountable for that. But I'm also gonna be available for you if you have questions. And then with customers, I mean, the worst customer is typically the one. I heard this quote once. It's simply the one that you didn't charge enough. But in reality, though, it's the one that you didn't set the proper expectations for. So when you're thinking about this triangle, this balance that's happening, and pulling from Lencioni's recommendations for a CEO, what insight could you offer there? Is there anything in addition to that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you talk to an employee that worked for me even 10, 20, 30 years ago, and you said, what's Joel's favorite saying, it's probably under promise, over deliver. And because what people don't understand is when you set that expectation, that's when everything happens. And too many CEOs, the number one failure mode of CEOs is what I call the cheerleader failure mode. They're always convinced everything's going to be great. We're going to win every game. They come to you and they give you the plan. We're going to do $1 million the first year. We're going to do $10 million the second year. We're going to do $50 million the third year. Well, you've now set an expectation of that shareholder. And when you come back and do $1 million, $2 million, $4 million, which would be on the same path that a Microsoft did, for example, I mean, doubling every year is tremendous, especially if you can continue that. But people are going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people don't understand the expectation setting, how important that is, because once you've set that expectation, you can't reel it back in. And so, expectations are everything.
So when it comes to shareholders, is there any advice you would give to a business owner that's in that transition period of 25 to 150 on how to make sure those expectations are set properly early on?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's part of the planning process. Again, you have to know the goals of those investors. Then I go through an exercise setting out strategic objectives out 3-4 years in the future that we agree on. If I can't come to that agreement, I don't want to do a deal. If when you make the investment, we can't agree on what would be success 3 or 4 years out, and I don't feel like that's realistic, then you shouldn't make the investment, right? And so it starts there. Do we have an agreed upon set of goals out, in the distant future that we're running towards? Doesn't mean we're going to get there. If things happen, I understand, but at least we've got a plan. And then we go from there to, setting quarterly goals that are the next milestone along the way to achieving that. And then I'm going to share with you, Mr. Investor, how we performed on those quarterly goals every quarter. And I'm not going to change it, or I'm not going to spin it and try to make it sound good. Yeah, we didn't hit this, but we should have been tracking this. People do that all the time in board meetings, and I'm just like, no, you told us last quarter you were going to do A.
Yeah.
How did you do on A? Don't change the metric, because you don't like the way the numbers came out. And so staying consistent with that process is really important to give confidence to your shareholders, because that's what's going to matter at the end of the day when, inevitably you hit a tough section. I mean, one of my businesses, we were operating, and I was at a trade show when 9/11 happened, and we were introducing our second product, just, trying to get to product market fit, trying to get some traction in the market. I'm at a trade show, I'm waiting for Jack Welch to appear on CNBC because he's just released his book, and I want to hear the interview. And the announcer comes on and, says that the first tower was hit and the second tower was hit, and we knew the whole world had changed. And so September 2002, I walked into a board meeting, and we had spent basically the whole year trying to sell the product, and we couldn't sell it.
Wow.
And I literally walked into the CIO's office of a Fortune 500 company. This CIO had a multi-billion-dollar budget. We gave the presentation. He said, "Joel, this is the best presentation I've ever seen from a startup." And if the product costs $1, I can't buy it.
Wow.
He had a multi-billion-dollar budget and had no discretionary authority to spend $1
Wow.
because of 9/11. And so I walked into a September 2002 board meeting. Number one item on the agenda is, hey, guys, I think I've got the right team. I think I've got a great product, but I can't sell it. And if it was my money, we got about $3 million left in the bank. If it was my money, I'd take it and go home.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And so then the investor looked across the table at me and said, hey, we got a checkbook. If you need more money, let me know.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, why did he say that? I would argue it because I had, over the 2 years we had been operating the business, he was confident I was giving him the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And if he hadn't felt that way, we'd have shut the board book and I'd have gone out and dissolved the company. And I was perfectly prepared to do that. It wasn't a play. It wasn't a game. I expected, to shut the board books and shut down the company. But he had the confidence because we had been transparent with him and clear with him all along what was going on. And you can't plan for 9/11, obviously.
Wow. Well, and we've had our own micro 9/11 since then too. So it's not an uncommon thing to face that struggle in the market where, you may be the perfect fit, but it's just not the right time.
That's right.
So you've obviously had quite a few experiences like this, and naturally that makes you a very qualified person to come talk to. So can you tell people? I've got a few more questions, but
sure.
Can you tell people? All right. So you've got all this experience. How can they engage with you? You mentioned the book earlier, but is there another way they can engage?
Yeah. So our website is CEOsys.co. And we engage, I do training classes for CEOs. I do training classes for CEOs and their executive team. I do training classes for management teams, all around how do you run a company well at scale. And again, this is not something that I see a lot of other people talking about. Tongue in cheek say I've got the best system in the world for being CEO because I don't know of anybody else's that really talks about it, again, at 150 plus employees. There's obviously things like EOS and stuff that are good operating systems for small mom and pop shops, great. But when you really get to the scaling part and you're really trying to maximize value in a business, there just isn't a lot of information about it. And so happy to engage with people. I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn and other places, and always happy to talk about these questions.
I love it. All right, 2 more questions. Yep. What common trends do you see executives thinking they need to get on board with that are really not good for business? Is there anything that you see, any habits that you're seeing leaders jump into that are like, hey, you really shouldn't be doing that? That's a trend. Is there anything that you're seeing along those lines?
Yeah, well, and I think this is common, right? In any of these trends, AI is the current trend. You usually get advantage if you're first, and you get advantage if you're near the last. It's the people in the middle that don't get much advantage. And you say this, in lots of different areas, right? Investing, somebody comes up with some great investing technique, like, private equity, the leveraged buyout was something that was invented back in the 80s, or maybe invented's the wrong word, but became popular. And it was great. There were plenty of companies you could buy in a leveraged sense that the numbers worked fantastically. But of course, once the cat was out of the bag, then there were 100 firms trying to do the same thing, and suddenly the numbers don't work so well. And so I think you see the same thing. Be careful of the latest trend unless you can be on the front wave of it and have some initial expertise. Otherwise, you're often better to just constantly watch it, but not make huge investments until later. I mean, we've been, I've seen the cycles on and off. From offshoring was, for a while we were going to offshore everything, and now we're going to bring things back. And do you know why you're offshoring? I mean, there's got to be good reasoning behind it. And so that would be my comment. There are a million of these trends. They come one right after the other.
All right. And then for any advice that you would give to new leaders who may not be at that 150 mark, but are aiming for that, what can they be doing now to prepare themselves for that? Yeah,
because there really isn't other jobs that train you for being CEO. I mean, I don't care how much sales experience you've had. You can have sold tens of billions of dollars. That doesn't make you qualified to be CEO of a company. A lot of people think, hey, I've been riding on this jet airplane. I'm a flight attendant and I've got 1 million miles. Does that make you qualified to fly the plane? No, of course not. But a lot of people have that view of business. And even boards, when they hire CEOs, a lot of time is about, hey, I've got this great salesperson. We'll make them CEO. And that's only a very small part of the job. And so I think you have to do learning around the CEO job if you want to have a chance to be successful when you reach the point where there is that full-time CEO job. So you got to engage, you got to read some books, you've got to talk to people, you've got to join groups, because your previous experience is not going to make you successful at the CEO at scale.
I love it. Love it. Joel, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and share this with the Good Business audience. It's been such a pleasure. I wish we could talk for hours, but since we can't, I'm just going to say, hey, y'all need to go and pick up his books. It's ceosys.co. So ceosys.co. Not .ceo, .co. Go and connect with Joel on LinkedIn. Listen to his content and engage with him. Are you still doing in-person coaching and all of that as well?
Oh, yeah, we do. Okay. I do a lot of in-person training and absolutely, and we do it at the Texas CEO Ranch, as you well know.
Yeah, love it, love it. Well, guys, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Good Business. We'll see you next week here in the studio.